What would you do to be free? It's a question most of us never truly have to answer. We take our freedom for granted, never imagining what we might become if it was stripped away completely. But imagine for a moment that you're trapped in the most brutal prison on earth. Worked to exhaustion every single day. Beaten. Starved. Surrounded by an ocean on one side and an endless, impenetrable wilderness on the other. Would you risk death for even the smallest chance at freedom? Would you endure unimaginable suffering? Would you cross a line so horrific, so fundamentally wrong, that there's no coming back from it? In 1822, one man answered all those questions, and his answers would make him one of history's most infamous figures. This is a story about survival, about desperation, and about how far human beings can fall when every other option is taken away. This is the true story of Alexander Pearce. Born in County Armagh, Ireland, around 1790, Pearce was not a violent criminal. He wasn't a murderer or a rapist. He was a labourer, a farmhand, struggling to survive in a country crushed under British rule. In 1819, he was convicted of stealing 6 pairs of shoes. 6 pairs of shoes. That was his crime. The punishment? 7 years transportation to the other side of the world. Think about that for a moment. For stealing shoes, probably to sell them, probably because he was desperate and hungry, Alexander Pearce was sentenced to 7 years in what was essentially hell on earth. He was shackled, thrown onto a convict ship, and sent on a journey that would take months. Many convicts died on the voyage. Those who survived often wished they hadn't, because their destination was Van Diemen's Land, a place the British Empire had carefully designed to destroy the human spirit, a place where men were sent not to be rehabilitated, but to be broken completely. Van Diemen's Land. Today we call it Tasmania, a beautiful island known for its wilderness and natural beauty. But in the early 1800s, it was Britain's dumping ground for convicts. And not just any convicts. The system was designed to be graduated. First-time offenders might go to the mainland colonies, but repeat offenders, troublemakers, or those who tried to escape, they were sent to Van Diemen's Land. And the worst of the worst was sent to Sarah Island. Picture this. An island in the middle of Macquarie Harbour on Tasmania's remote west coast, surrounded by the freezing Southern Ocean. The nearest settlement, over 200 kilometres away through completely uncharted, dense rainforest. The island itself was less than a square kilometre of rock and misery. There were no walls needed at Sarah Island. The wilderness was the wall. The ocean was the moat. And both were utterly unforgiving. The conditions were designed to break men. Convicts were forced to cut down enormous one-pine trees in the surrounding forest trees that had stood for thousands of years. They hauled these massive logs through knee-deep mud and freezing water. They worked from dawn until dark, every single day, in all weather. The rain on Tasmania's west coast is relentless. It rains more than 200 days a year. The convicts were always wet, always cold, always exhausted. And if you didn't work fast enough, if you complained, if you looked at a guard the wrong way, the lash, 50 lashes, 100 lashes. Men's backs were shredded so badly they could barely stand. Some died from the infections, but that was almost preferable to surviving, because then you just had to go back to work the next day. This was Alexander Pearce's reality. Day after day, month after month, year after year. Can you imagine what that does to a person's mind? On September 20th, 1822, Alexander Pearce made a choice. He'd been at Sarah Island for several years by this point. He'd endured the lashings, the starvation, the brutal labour. He'd watched men die. He'd seen some go mad. And he'd had enough. Along with 7 other desperate men, Robert Grenell, John Mather, Thomas Bodnam, William Kennelly, Matthew Travers, Edward Brown, and Alexander Dalton, he decided that anything was better than one more day in that hell. They slipped away from the logging work party just as dusk was falling. The guards were tired, careless. They didn't notice 8 men simply walking into the forest and not coming back. By the time the alarm was raised, Pearce and the others were already deep in the wilderness. 8 men. No food. No map. No compass. No real survival skills. Just a desperate, burning hope for freedom and a vague plan to walk north toward the settled areas of Tasmania. They carried one axe between them. A small pot for cooking, though they had nothing to cook. And the clothes on their backs, prison clothes, threadbare and useless against the cold and rain. They believed, they had to believe, that they could hunt for food, find berries, follow rivers to civilization. They'd heard stories of the Aboriginal people who lived in harmony with this land. Surely, they thought, if the Aboriginals could survive here, so could they. They were wrong. Catastrophically wrong. The Tasmanian wilderness gave them absolutely nothing. This wasn't a forest like they knew in Ireland or England. There were no rabbits to trap, no deer to hunt. The trees, ancient myrtle beech, sassafras, Huon pine, they'd been standing for thousands of years, creating a canopy so dense that almost nothing grew on the forest floor. No berries, no edible plants they recognized. Even if there had been game, they had no way to catch it. The axe wasn't a hunting tool. It was barely useful for cutting through the dense undergrowth. The Aboriginal people of Tasmania, the Palawa, had lived in harmony with this land for over 40,000 years. But they had generations of knowledge, skills passed down through countless lifetimes. They knew which plants were edible, where to find food, how to read the land and the weather. Pearce and his companions had none of that. They were lost almost immediately, walking in circles, expending precious energy going nowhere. By day 4, the gnawing hunger in their bellies had become unbearable. They tried eating bark. It made them violently sick. They tried catching fish in the streams with their bare hands. Nothing. The cold was seeping into their bones. They were wet constantly. Their clothes never dried. Some of the men's feet were so badly blistered that they left bloody footprints. They could barely walk, but they had to keep moving. To stop was to die. By day 10, they weren't men anymore. They were walking corpses, skeletal figures stumbling through the fog. One man, Matthew Travers, collapsed and couldn't get up. His injury, probably sustained in a fall, had become infected. He was delirious with fever. Another, Thomas Bodnam, was so weak he could barely stand. And that's when the whispers started. The thought that had been lurking in all their minds, growing louder with each step, each hunger pang, each moment of utter despair. On day 15, someone finally spoke it out loud. They were all going to die unless they did something. Something unthinkable. Something that violated every rule of civilization, every moral code, every human instinct. But what choice did they have? Let everyone die slowly and painfully? Or let one die so the others might have a chance? They drew lots. Or at least, that's what they told themselves. The weakest man, Alexander Dalton, was chosen. Some accounts say he agreed, that he knew he was dying anyway and wanted his death to mean something. Other accounts say he begged for his life. We'll never know the truth. What we do know is that they killed him. They used the axe. And then they crossed the ultimate taboo. They told themselves it was survival. They told themselves they had no choice. They told themselves it was mercy. But once that line was crossed, everything changed. Because now they all knew what they were capable of. That first killing changed everything. For a few days, maybe a week, it sustained them. Gave them the strength to keep walking. But hunger came back. It always comes back. And now they all knew what the solution was. But nobody wanted to be next. The group became fractured by suspicion and fear. Nobody trusted anyone. Every glance became a potential threat. Every moment alone with another person could be your last. William Kennelly was next. Then John Mather. One killing led to another. And another. Some men were murdered in their sleep, or what passed for sleep. Quick moments of unconsciousness where exhaustion briefly overwhelmed terror. Others were killed after violent struggles. The strongest survived, but strong no longer meant who had the most muscle or stamina. It meant who was the most ruthless, who hesitated the least, who could kill a companion and then keep walking. Two men, Edward Brown and Thomas Bodnam, finally couldn't take it anymore. They were horrified by what they'd become, what they'd done, what they were willing to do to survive. They made a choice that seems impossible to comprehend. They turned back towards Sarah Island. They chose to walk back toward the guaranteed torture, the flogging, possibly even execution. Because at least at Sarah Island, they knew what to expect. They knew the rules. With their remaining companions, there were no rules anymore. Just survival. Just the axe and the question of who would wield it next. The ones who turned back never made it. They died in the wilderness, their bodies never found. But they died as men, not monsters. That was their choice. Meanwhile, the group that kept going was now down to just a few. Pearce, Grinnell, and one or two others. Accounts vary on exactly when each man died. What's certain is that the killings continued. The survivors kept walking north, kept trying to find civilization, kept consuming their companions. Eventually, only 3 remained: Alexander Pearce, Robert Grenell, and one other man whose name is lost to history. Then 2. And this is where the story becomes almost unbearable. Pearce and Grenell, walking side by side through the wilderness, both exhausted beyond measure, both starving despite their horrible sustenance, and both knowing with absolute certainty that only one of them would survive. Because there wasn't enough food for 2, and neither man trusted the other enough to close his eyes. 4 days, maybe weeks, they walked together in silence, watching, waiting, neither daring to sleep, neither daring to walk behind the other. They must have been hallucinating from exhaustion and hunger, seeing things in the fog, hearing voices. But through it all, they maintained this terrible, silent vigil. 2 men who'd become predators, circling each other, waiting for the other to show weakness. Finally, Robert Grenell made a mistake. Maybe he dozed off for just a moment. Maybe he stumbled and fell. Maybe his body simply gave out after so much suffering. That's all Alexander Pearce needed. 1 moment of weakness. 1 opportunity. The last man died. And Alexander Pearce walked on alone. Truly alone now, for the first time in over 3 months. Can you imagine what that must have been like? Walking through that wilderness, completely alone, carrying the weight of what he'd done? 7 men had died. 7 men he'd known, talked with, probably even considered friends at some point. And he'd survived by consuming them. Did he feel guilt? Remorse? Relief? Horror at what he'd become? We'll never know what thoughts went through his mind during those final days alone in the wilderness. On January 11th, 1823, exactly 113 days after escaping Sarah Island, Alexander Pearce staggered out of the wilderness near a settlement. He was barely recognizable as human. His weight had dropped to almost nothing. He was just skin stretched over bones. His feet were torn and infected. His clothes were rotting rags. His hair and beard were matted and filthy. But he was alive. Against all odds, against every expectation, against nature itself, he had survived. The locals who found him were terrified. They thought he was some kind of wild man, maybe insane. They brought him to the authorities. And when the authorities searched him, making sure he had no weapons, they found something in his pockets that made their blood run cold. Pieces of dried human flesh, carefully preserved, carried all this way. The evidence of his unimaginable journey. Alexander Pearce confessed everything. And I mean everything. He didn't hold back a single detail. He described each killing, each name. He described it all with a calm, matter-of-fact tone that disturbed his interrogators almost as much as the content of his confession. But here's the thing about the truth. Sometimes it's too horrible to believe. The authorities listened to his story and decided he must be lying. Cannibalism? 8 men devouring each other one by one? Impossible. Too monstrous. Too theatrical. They convinced themselves it was a cover story. They believed the other men had successfully escaped and Pearce was protecting them, buying them time to get further away. The flesh in his pockets? They had explanations for that too. Explanations they found more palatable than the truth. So they sent Alexander Pearce back to Sarah Island. Back to the same hell he'd risked everything to escape. Back to the brutal labor, the lashings, the starvation, the rain. Can you imagine what that must have felt like? To survive 113 days of absolute horror, to endure the unendurable, to do things that haunt your soul, and then to be sent right back to where you started? The authorities thought they were calling his bluff, that eventually he'd break down and admit where the others really were. But Pearce had nothing to admit. He'd already told them the truth. The other men were dead, their bones scattered across hundreds of miles of Tasmanian wilderness. And so Alexander Pearce went back to cutting down trees and hauling logs and sleeping in wet, cold misery. But something had changed in him. Something fundamental. Whether it was the wilderness that changed him, or whether it simply revealed what was always there, we'll never know. But what happened next would remove all doubt about his story. Here's where the story takes its darkest turn. In November 1823, barely a year after his first escape, barely months after being sent back to Sarah Island, Alexander Pearce escaped again. This time with just one companion, a young convict named Thomas Cox. Cox was in his early 20s, relatively new to the penal colony. Maybe he didn't know about Pearce's history. Maybe he'd heard the stories but didn't believe them. Or maybe he was so desperate to escape that he was willing to take the risk. Whatever his reasoning, it was a fatal mistake. This time, the authorities were ready. They knew Pearce was dangerous, even if they didn't believe his cannibal story. Search parties were organized quickly. Dogs were brought in. The men on horseback knew the terrain. Pearce and Cox didn't have the head start the first group had. They were caught after just 10 days. 10 days. Not even 2 weeks. And when the authorities searched Alexander Pearce, they found pieces of Thomas Cox's flesh on him. Still fresh. Still bloody. Unmistakable. This time, there was no room for doubt, no possibility of misunderstanding. But here is the thing. Here's the detail that made everyone's blood run cold and that transformed Pearce from a survivor into something far more sinister. When they searched Pearce, they also found bread. Real food. Provisions. He had food. He wasn't starving. He wasn't facing imminent death. He didn't need to kill Thomas Cox to survive. So why did he do it? This is the question that haunts this story. The first escape, you can understand it, horrible as it was. Survival cannibalism, driven by starvation and desperation. It happens in extreme circumstances. The Donner Party, the Uruguayan rugby team whose plane crashed in the Andes. Throughout history, when humans face starvation, some will do the unthinkable to survive. We can't condone it, but we can at least understand the desperation that drives it. But this was different. Pearce had food. He wasn't lost in an impenetrable wilderness. They'd only been gone 10 days. He could have survived until they were caught. So what happened? Had something broken in Alexander Pearce during that first nightmare journey? Had crossing the taboo once made it easier to cross it again? Had he discovered that he liked it? Or had the trauma, the guilt, the horror of what he'd done the first time driven him insane? This time, there was no denying the evidence. This time, nobody could claim Alexander Pearce was lying or protecting other escapees. The proof was irrefutable. Thomas Cox was dead, portions of his body were found on Pearce, and there were witnesses who could attest that Pearce had access to other food. Alexander Pearce stood trial for murder. Not for the first escape. Those deaths happened in the wilderness without witnesses, and the other men's bodies were never recovered. But for Thomas Cox, the evidence was undeniable. The trial was brief. Pearce's confession was detailed, matter-of-fact, and utterly chilling. He showed no remorse. He didn't beg for mercy. He explained his actions as calmly as if he were describing a walk in the park. The prosecution argued he was a cold-blooded murderer who developed a taste for human flesh. The defense? There wasn't much they could say. They tried to argue insanity, that the first escape had broken his mind. But the jury wasn't convinced. The verdict came quickly. Guilty of murder. The sentence? Death by hanging. It was inevitable, really. Colonial Tasmania had no patience for such crimes. The date was set for July 19th, 1824, and hundreds of people came to watch. Public executions were common entertainment in those days, but this one was special. This was the cannibal convict, the man who'd survived the impossible and become a monster in the process. Alexander Pearce walked to the gallows calmly. He didn't struggle, didn't plead, didn't pray. And his last words, if the reports are accurate, though historians debate this, his last words have become infamous. Man's flesh is delicious. It tastes far better than fish or pork. Whether he actually said this or whether it was added later to make the story more sensational, we'll never know. But it's the quote that history remembers. The trapdoor opened. Alexander Pearce died. But even in death, he wasn't left in peace. His body was cut down and handed over to surgeons for dissection. This was standard practice for executed criminals in the colonial era. Their bodies became property of science. But for Pearce, it felt particularly appropriate, perhaps even ironic. The man who had treated human bodies as meat was himself reduced to a medical specimen. His skull was eventually cleaned and preserved, passed through various collections, and ultimately ended up in a museum. A grim artifact, a silent witness to one of history's darkest chapters. You can still see it today if you visit the Wright Museum in Tasmania, a reminder that this story, as horrific as it sounds, actually happened. So what do we make of Alexander Pearce? The facts are undeniable. He killed and consumed at least 6 men, possibly more. But the context matters too. He was sent to a place designed to break human beings, surrounded by a wilderness that offered nothing but death. Given an impossible choice, commit an unthinkable act, or die slowly and painfully. The first escape, you could argue that was pure survival. Desperate men in desperate circumstances. But the second escape, that's where the questions get harder. Was Pearce a monster created by the British penal system? Or was he a monster who would have emerged regardless? Did the wilderness change him? Or did it simply reveal what was already there? Here's what we know for certain. The British penal system in Van der Menes land was designed to destroy men, not rehabilitate them. Sarah Island was hell on earth. And Alexander Pearce, a man convicted of stealing shoes, became one of history's most notorious cannibals because of it. Was he evil? Was he insane? Was he simply a survivor who did what he had to do, and then couldn't find his way back? I don't have those answers. Maybe there aren't any good answers. But the question itself tells us something important about human nature, about how far we can fall when we are pushed to the edge. What do you think? Was Alexander Pearce a victim of circumstance who became a monster? Or was he always a monster waiting for the right circumstances? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this journey into dark history compelling, hit that like button, subscribe for more stories from the shadows of history, and ring the bell so you never miss an upload.